different jurisdictions throughout the United States have approached this differently. Some of them have begun to follow the NCAA guidelines, the current NCAA guidelines, which essentially require participation in sports according to assigned sex at birth, except when hormonal transition has either begun or has been completed. The question that we have right now is not only what happens in high school sports, because I think when we think of sports, we think of high school, but we also have competitive athletics on various levels from K to 12. And so we're going to do a little more work on and a little more conversation, maybe even with the medical community, on the developmental appropriateness of guidelines as they relate to students at various stages in our schools. I think there are other jurisdictions throughout the United States that have been wide open. Oregon, as an example, just allows participation in sports according to gender identity. The DOJ and US Ed guidelines that came out, I guess, what was that, about 2 months ago? Something like that, yeah. Was it last month? Yeah. Time goes slow, I guess, yeah. So time flies when you're having fun, I guess that means something. So that DOJ and US Ed guidance does not prescribe that basically it allows some flexibility for sex segregated sports participation, but will allow for the way Oregon's doing it as well. We're in continued conversations with our principals and CASs around this. It's a little complicated as well because we have various leagues. We have public school leagues on each of the islands, as well as the HHSSA, the Hawaii High School Sports Association. And so we have to get everyone in the room and make sure we're on the same page and balance competitive fairness, safety, with inclusiveness. And so we're at this point, we don't have any changes proposed with regards to competitive athletics. With regards to implementation, which I know will be a question, let me first say we do not have it all figured out yet with regards to implementations. Let me just say that before the questions come, because I think that'll let everyone know where we are. After we finish today, we're going to set up some meetings next week around how do we actually get training out to our schools. What I'll say for sure is we will train all of our principals. We're going to have training at the Educational Leadership Institute, which is the conference that we have for all of our educational officers this summer. We'll have mandatory training for all of our EOs, athletic directors, and coaches as well. But we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like, and I ask for the board's patience in getting time to work with our folks to figure that out. I mentioned official and unofficial records and made that distinction. The distinction is not always clear in our own processes. So part of what we have to figure out is, so we have definitions of what happens with official and unofficial records. Now we have to actually look at something and say, well, is this an official and unofficial record? Sometimes that's not exactly clear. Then there are facilities issues, big facilities issues, and I mean like long-term facilities issues with regards to restrooms and locker rooms in terms of the way we build and retrofit and maintain our facilities. And those are issues that probably can't be solved by a work group or even within a year or 5 years, but there's something that we're going to have to think about going forward. So again, proud to be here today. I think we've taken some steps forward, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Deputy. We have some questions. Mr. Brennan, Lee.
So this is not really a question, but if I may I kind of like recap what kind of the students talked about during the Hawaii State Student Conference?
Definitely, please do.
Yeah, so I kind of held back on this report because I wanted to kind of be in line with today's presentation. But so in our January meeting, so like 5 months ago, we had Ms. Ng come to the Hawaii State Student Council. We had a group discussion. We kind of moved all the tables back and we sat in a giant ring. And Ms. Ng was kind of at one end, and we kind of like had the students kind of led their own discussion. So in the beginning, we kind of talked about defining the term. I think Ms. Ng was really impressed with how like our generation or our particular group of students should kind of like have a larger context to pull from. I guess that kind of stems from the fact that it's more publicized in the media now, and I think students are more open than they were in previous years. So I think she was pretty impressed by that. But yeah, I think students, they had some issues about accommodating transgender students, because I think regardless of what they know, I think it's important that we all recognize that, they're students, and regardless of what you believe in, they deserve equal education, and to accommodate them, I think, is really important. So one of the main issues is, like, what the students thought was, how can you distinguish between someone that consistently identifies with the opposite gender versus someone that is just confused? So, like, an issue like that might be kind of, like, difficult to kind of, determine what sports team you can play on and stuff like that. Another one is that, talking about the athletics too. I'm not sure if, I think concerns were brought up about that as well, like what team they should be playing on. But things we learned is that gender identification and sexual orientation might be two separate entities. So, so sex is defined as like your biologic sex, like what you were, when you were born, what was like the genetic predisposition, like were you male or female? Sexual orientation is kind of like what you kind of, like your preference, your sexual preference. So I think those two things might be more separate, especially when you like learn, kind of like look into like what's going on in the media and kind of like learn a little bit more. So I think that's kind of what students kind of agree on. Like they're two separate things.
Thank you. I think Siobhan, Ms. Ng was very impressed with the group. It's always fun to talk to kids. And that issue of exclusively and consistently identifying, that was our previous verbiage. And through the feedback, it was actually changed to sincerely held. From the feedback from student council as well as some other stakeholders. Is that exclusively and consistently was going to be really hard to define, and it also might have been a little bit too narrow. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always important to hear from students. We're going to start with Ms. Cox, and then Mr. Horner, and then Ms. Askelby. Did you have your hand up? I thought you did. I was going to give you first dibs.
It's not really a question. I just think that you're on the right track, and I think things are going to work out okay. I just know that there'll be a few bumps in the road, and that's okay. But I honestly think this is exactly what we need to be doing for our kids. And so I hope people keep an open mind about the actual working through of who can get into what bathroom and how you're going to handle all of that at school level. So the training that you're going to give is going to be extremely important, because as the students say, we need to make sure that all kids are treated fairly and that they all have access to the education that they need.
Thank you, Ms. Cox. Mr. Horner. Or Ms. Askelby. You have the floor.
Steve, you mentioned 2 or 3 times the term parent. But I've read your plan and policies. It's pretty clear in the plan and policy. Let's take a 6-year-old child. And he or she has this, quote, this sincerely decided that they want to make this change. So if I understand your policy, it's parents are optional, correct? In fact, it specifically says that there's ways to communicate with the student where you secretly don't inform the parent.
Where
Page 4.
Sorry, I have a PowerPoint. Let me
This
see.
is initial meeting may or may not include the student's parents. And then if you look at your policy, if the student parent are not aware, then how will the homeschool communication, how will the school-to-home communication information be handled? Which applies to me, I guess you can communicate with the child in a way where the parent doesn't know they're being communicated with.
Before you answer that question, I just want to make a clarification that we have policies, and then these are guidelines, and so not to be confused, the policies are set in stone in terms of 305.10, and what they're putting forth are guidelines, which are how to act out policies. So just to be clear about what terms we use, are you talking about the guidelines?
I'm talking about the
Guidelines on page 4.
position of the department recommending to the board from a 30,000-foot level, but the position is the relationship to parents. And I'm reading the policy and also, more importantly, the plan that would be used with the child, because the parent is not involved with this plan, and the parent is not communicated the plan by definition.
So I think you're looking at the third paragraph on page 4.
Actually, that's third and fourth, yes, sir. It says, and parents, quote, if involved on the fourth paragraph.
Yeah, so I guess I would see that as not, not prohibiting the inclusion of, or the communication with parents. It says may or may not involve the parent in the initial meeting. And I think, I think,
I'm talking about a 6-year-old child.
yeah, well, so I guess my thinking, and I'm not sure if it's the same as yours, but is there may be a
I
little
don't have
bit
any
of,
thinking, Assistant Superintendent, I'm asking what the position of the administration is in relationship to parents. Does parents have any rights in this process? That's my question to you.
do parents have any rights in this process?
And based on everything I've read, and I've read it, I think several times, they don't.
I'm not sure I see it that way, but I think the,
But then how do you explain the plan, which says the student parent guard are not aware, and then we'll find out a way to communicate with the student where the parent doesn't know, on page 3 in your plan.
so isn't that asking how will we communicate with the parent?
It implies the parent doesn't know that it's a 6-year-old child, and the council have decided that the plan is being implemented, but you're being implemented without the parent's knowledge.
So I guess maybe it's a matter of sequence here, because for me, what it's saying is initially, you may or may not include the parent in the communication, but then even right here, it's saying, how will that be communicated with the parent? I also might see a difference between the way in which we treat the situation with a 6-year-old child versus a 17-year-old child. So that could be something that we look at in the guidelines, because I certainly respect, I mean, as a parent myself, I think I always want to know what's going on in those conversations.
But nothing in this policy, or, and I don't know what you want to call it, Chair, but whatever these recommendations are, or these thought guidelines or whatever, nothing in here is any requirement that the parent for that 6-year-old child would be involved. Says the student or their parent guardian may initiate a meeting with the counselors, et cetera, but it goes on to say parenthetic and parents if involved. So it specifically says if involved. It
Board
doesn't
Member
say
Porter,
are involved.
if I can add to the conversation, this is one of the issues that we really struggled with, trying to, parent notification and how are we going to include the parents. One of the issues that we have to wrangle with is student privacy, and there are some situations in which you have a
I'm
student.
talking about a 6-year-old child.
Right, so with a 6-year-old child, reasonably you can expect that the parents are involved at that point.
That's not a definitive answer. So you're saying reasonably, that means it's still in your mind, a 6-year-old child, the parent would not, in certain cases, be involved.
I don't think that we would have a situation like that, truthfully, with a 6-year-old child. I think when we're talking about, the parents may or may not be involved, I think we're thinking more on the secondary level, where you have a
Let's stay with my
situation.
6-year-old child. I need a
Okay, well, with
definitive
the
answer. Are they
6-year-old
involved or are
child-
they not involved? It's just a simple question.
Okay, can I just, Mr. Horner, I think you're making a point, and I think it's a good one about the difference perhaps in the way in which we might treat a situation with an elementary age child
Keep
versus a
using
secondary child.
may, et cetera.
Okay,
I'm
so
looking for policy.
if we may, we'll take a look, we'll take your feedback take a look at these guidelines.
Because the
and see if
plan
we might make some
specifically shows
edits.
that the parent is not involved, and you go to lengths to figure out a way to make sure the parent doesn't know they're involved.
Understood, and I think this is one of the issues that we have with many of the situations is it may be different at elementary versus secondary, and so we'll take a look. This is the kind of thing that I think we'll
Second question.
find out along the way.
So it is whose decision at the school level makes the determination of, quote, if the child is sincere, unquote?
Well, this is
And what's the Attorney General saying about the liability of that decision on the part of the state? So what you're saying is the state will decide whether that child is, quote, confused or sincere. And then they'll do an appropriate plan based on that decision. Right?
Sure.
The states will make that determination. Is that right, Steve?
Let's give a moment.
Sorry, I don't know what they're showing.
So we're on to the second question.
Yeah, so the question is one of sincerely held.
Yes, sir.
So I think we started with the verbiage being exclusively and consistently identifying and moved to sincerely held based on sort of feedback and conversations around it. I understand that it may, it's not going to be particularly prescriptive. It's not going to tell you in every situation whether something is sincerely held.
Is that the principal's responsibility or the counselor's responsibility? Who in the state makes that determination? You determine that the parent
I'm not
is not involved.
Well, I think it would depend on the structure in the school and how they're dealing with the situation.
Okay. And last question, Chair, I'm sorry. This proposal, what do we call it, mandates that the counselor will meet with the child quarterly. It's mandatory. So my only question is, like many things the department does, where does the resources come from? Our counselors now have a couple hundred kids they're assigned. You're again putting an unfunded mandate on the part of the schools, and I just challenge that notion that this is a substantial amount of work, which I'm not against this, I'm just trying to understand the implementation challenges that you're proposing here, that now that counselor must meet with that child mandatorily, quarterly. There's also a structure in here where if that child gives a signal to someone, there's supposed to be a response from the school.
The verbiage in there is actually not mandatory.
It does say
That
mandatory,
should.
sir.
Mr. Horner, can you point out what page you're looking at and what area?
That's the way I read it. Page 4 again.
Paragraph 4.
Oh, I see, page 4, fourth paragraph.
Right.
Once a plan is established, the counselor administrator should then follow up with the appropriate school personnel.
I read should.
Oh, and then in the second paragraph, so a transgender student who is ready to socially transition, regardless of whether the student is undergoing medical transition, may initiate a process to change how the student is addressed.
Now, I'm reading the sentence that says a counselor administrator should revisit, and that's where we get liability. The counselor or administrator should revisit this plan every quarter with the student and parent if they're involved for continued appropriate. It's like a leg where you basically have to have an ICC. I'm not challenging the fact that we should do that. I'm just asking the question of where the economic resources are coming from to do it.
Yeah, I don't read that as mandatory. I don't read the word should as mandatory. If softening it would help, I don't know. But it is guidelines, and it is what we're proposing to folks as guidelines, but it's not a shall.
So the issue is more with the resources and making sure that there is that ability for schools.
And the liability, so if something happens and we didn't quarterly consult with that child, then we have liability in the process.
I think that's where there's a distinction between guidelines, that these are guidelines.
Yes.
So thank you, Mr. Horner. Mr. DeLima.
Well, bottom line is, parents need to be involved, wherever the guardians or caregivers are. I mean, we have an end policy that says that. Our end policy says parents are, exact wording, but well, the bottom line is, we have it throughout our policy E2, where it talks about parents being involved. So, you know, Mr. Horner asked a simple question, and I think the simple answer is, yeah, parents should be advised. Now, I read the guidelines as saying, some parents may get involved, some parents may not get involved. And if the parent doesn't choose to get involved and leaves the circumstances to their, because I tell you right now, I've experienced a situation where a transgender student who was a friend of my younger daughter, she wasn't supported by her father at home. But he didn't come to school and protest it. He let his daughter grow and be involved in a positive way, and the school was very supportive of that. Now, if that parent chose to become involved, they would be involved. And there's nothing in our policy or guideline that prohibits that. So, Mr. Horner asked a serious and fair question. And I think the answer is parents need to become involved if they want to be involved. Now, our state law, our constitutional decisions basically say parents are responsible for their children unless they determine to be unfit. Now, there are circumstances as children grow older. There are dynamics in every household where some students have become rebellious, and there's a nature of what occurs within the school environment. And I think every day, high school administrators and counselors deal with the internal struggles between adolescent student and maybe some of the difficulties they may be having at home. And I think that's a challenge for the schools. And I don't see how we're going to be able to draft that in a policy per se. But I think the recognition is that, and I have some concern about this every quarter type of situation. It seems burdensome to the student, to the transgender student. They're trying to fit in, and all of a sudden you require the student to have to check in every quarter. It can be viewed as intimidating in a way. So where it may be viewed as being healthy, it could also be viewed as intimidating. So I think you need to take a step back and really rethink that. I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to say we want to be concerned about their mental health, their well-being. We want to be able to check in to see if somebody is bullying them. I think that was the purpose of putting that language in there. But I would really want us to celebrate the guidelines for what it was intended. It was intended to be supportive, and I think that the opening way is the aloha that we expect all our students to receive from each other and from the community at large. There will be some dynamics as we work through these policies, but it needs to be viewed in a healthy, involved way, including parents. And if a parent protests the situation, or they are refuting perhaps the student's assertion of their own gender identity, that is something the school needs to deal with, and not and deal with the reality that the parent is still the parent. And perhaps, suggest conjoint therapy, suggest some other positive alternatives to deal with the situation. But we shouldn't become involved in trying to lodge and becoming involved in some familial dynamics that are difficult and that exist in households throughout our state. So I just wanted to pontificate as well on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you. But yes, Ms. Hasselbeck.
Thank you for the presentation and all your ladies' hard work on this, and Yvonne. So just to go back to the discussion from Mr. Horner and Mr. DeLima, it is our state law that children over the age of 13 can seek medical care without their parents' consent. a bill just passed the state legislature, and I'm not sure if it's been signed yet by the governor, that allows children over the age of 13 to seek mental and behavioral health care without their parents' consent. And so certainly our policy is to have involved parents or guardians, but we all know from our own experience that that is not always the case. I think what we've seen at our school-based health centers over 2 months is about 95% of our patients that we're seeing there do not live with their custodial parents. So those types of issues, come into play when we are actually physically, literally implementing these guidelines at the school level. And so, as we're sort of treading new territory, we're going to have to learn what best practices are in terms of, and is it right for the student that check in every month or a quarter? For some students it may be, for others it may not be, and we may find out, we should actually, when we implement a plan, they should check in every month, and then after 6 months we do it once a year. Who knows? I hope that our administrators are responsible providing feedback on these guidelines, and we will refine them, improve them, and I just really appreciate your hard work in looking at some of the school districts and the federal guidelines and trying to make sense of this for Hawaii. I know you've been working on it many months, so mahalo for that. The one that was brought up that I had a question about, you mentioned competitive sports, and so you said there are NCAA guidelines, but do we have anything in our Hawaii high school athletics? Because, to me it seems like, it's kind of easier for elementary or middle school kids because there's so many sports leagues right now that are mixed gender anyway. My kids play on soccer teams that are boys and girls, and it's the boys team, or vice versa, same for basketball and other. It's just when you get to high school athletics and it's competitive and it means a scholarship and you want to win, then that the issue of gender identity potentially becomes more of a pointed thing. And so I'm just wondering, what is our policy now in terms of that discussion that you're having?
So my kids also participate in co-ed sports at this time. I think one of the things to note here is that we have kind of a complicated governance relationship with the various leagues. So the OIA, then there's a COI, MIL. So every island has its own public school league, and then the Hawaii High School League, which includes private schools as well. And so governance-wise, it's a bit complicated, and while the OIA is actually a separate body that the DOE doesn't officially govern, it's the people who run it are our employees. So it's a bit complicated there, right? The practice has been that students participate in sports according to their assigned sex at birth. That's been the practice up until this point. And what I think we want to make sure of and is that we're all acting in concert. I know that the OIA, and we've had some conversations with the HHSSA and showed them these guidelines. And it's one of the reasons we have not recommended any significant changes as yet, because we want to make sure that we get everybody in the room and get on the same page, have one message, one vision going forward. But the current practice is students do not participate in sports necessarily by gender identity alone. They participate by their assigned sex.
Yes, Mr. Min.
Your statement about discussion and feedback around competitive athletics has been robust, and I think it's a very tactful statement. It brings back memories of a while back when I had the honor of vice chairing the Title IX implementation. And I want to let you know I wasn't the very most popular person when I went to talk to the ADs rather, because it was a complete paradigm shift, and I think you're dealing with the same issue here. And so what I think is really important is what Member Cox talked about, training. You need to really make sure that those athletic areas, people are trained, those coaches are very trained. And I think it's important because if you're going to get a lawsuit, I believe that's where it'll come from. And sports nowadays is a dynamic thing now where we're changing. We have girls actually playing on men's team, boys' team. So this is one area I really think we should go back and really look at it and talk to them and massage it, because it took me a long time. I was very unwelcome at certain campuses, you know, trying to introduce. And you look at what's happening today, girls are wearing shorts. I mean, it's common. So I think this is really important. I think it's like you said, it's in fluidity, and it's gonna, and we as a board should be ready to, you know, constantly accept this type of change. So I think you're doing a good job, and I'm glad that you understand that these things are gonna come. But like Title IX, you're gonna have your bumps and obstacles and things, but the main thing I think is if you get the coaches and all these people to slowly understand and like endorse, and I think things will work. The last thing I would say is go back to the actual students themselves and ask them about this plan and ask them about things that, you know, we talked about, and get their input. Because they're the ones that are, you know, will be the ones suffering. They're the ones who know mostly about it, especially in terms of parents and things like that. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Mr. Horner.
Page 4, I appreciate the fact you've got some guideline specific examples. I'm a little confused by reading it. Let's assume I'm a teacher, and I appreciate the fact HSTA's endorsing this, but frankly, as a teacher, I'm on hall monitor. And so example 1, it says down at the bottom, the student appears to be male, is seen walking into the girls' restroom. Okay. The student should be allowed to use the restroom of the gender which the student identifies. So the male student would be able to go into the girls' restroom. I get that. So you're telling the teacher that's responsible that they should allow that to happen. When approached by the school personnel, the student indicates that their sincerely held gender identity is, quote, female. Inform the student that upon request, the school will work with the student regarding sport accommodation. I guess my question is, student A, that he/she is walking into the girls' bathroom, do they have a plan or they don't have a plan? Or does it matter to you? In other words, using the school facility, the opposite facility, before the plan or after the plan?
I mean, is the question, in order to be eligible to
Yeah.
use the...
So any boy child on Tuesday decides he feels that way, that he'd be able to go to a girls' bathroom. He doesn't have to go through the council process and what have you. Is that what, for example, 1?
Yeah, I don't think we'd be requiring a plan in every situation to access a particular restroom according to the child's gender identity. I think it's one of those things where we would want to offer it, offer kind of the supports necessary.
Any child, anytime can use any bathroom they choose.
Well, that's not exactly, because I think the question becomes whether or not that belief is sincerely held or they're just looking for the shortest
That's to
line.
determine that, so the teacher on the hall monitor has to make that determination at the time.
Well, I mean, teachers generally are not hall monitors, so I think that you...
Well, I'm a teacher, I'm walking down this, in this obvious male student goes into the girls' bathroom, or the girls complain that this male student has gone into that bathroom.
And I mean, those will be the complicated issues that we're gonna have to deal with. I think these are new worlds. to
Saying
be
is there
honest.
is no requirement of a plan.
There's no requirement that you have like an official, like a plan in place before you access.
Because that's
some
the way I
facility.
read it, it says that part of the plan, it specifically says where you may use the bathrooms. That's what the plan says. It specifically gives you these bathrooms you can use, what the plan says.
That doesn't mean that everyone necessarily needs to use this template as a plan. It's not like it doesn't become a mandatory prerequisite. That's the way I'm expecting our guidelines to be interpreted. Now, if it's interpreted as more mandatory or more prescriptive, that in your reading, that can be something to look at.
It says sex segregated facilities. Students will use the following restrooms on campus, on page 3. Students will use the following locker room facilities on campus, colon. It implies to me that there's specifically places where there's safe havens for them to use the locker room or bathroom. But when I read the example, this implies that they can use, well, anyone can use, if they just feel that day, they haven't gone and had a conversation about sincerely feeling this way, and basically went to the counselor's office, that anyone that says when may go into the opposite sex bathroom.
I'm not sure.
Well, just explain example 1 to me on page 4.
So if a student wants to go into a bathroom that is corresponding with their sincerely held gender identity, they should be allowed to do so.
Whether they have a plan or not.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Min, I think wanted to comment on that, and Ms. Cox.
Yeah, I think Mr. Hunter does have a point in terms of, I don't know if you need a plan, but you do need some type of school process. I know when I used to, run to the hall, if I saw a student walking into a female bathroom, I would definitely, we should have something in the school says to go there and address the student first and make sure that, he is going to the, correct area. So I think he has a point in terms of schools should have something, because if they all know what to do, at least we won't be facing some liability because someone did this and someone did it. But I think as most teachers, we would definitely go in there and address it and find out. So I think you need to look at that statement so that it doesn't slant itself to what Mr. Horner is saying.
Thank you, Mr. Min. Ms. Cox.
Well, I think there's a lot in this plan that needs to be cleaned up. I'll say that first. And as ex-principal of a middle school, you definitely need to have a plan in place when school starts so that all the kids know a process somehow or another. Because I've had lots of boys trying to sneak into the girls' bathrooms in the past. So what he's pointing out is, that middle school does some fun things. You're not talking about a kindergartner or a first grader that does that kind of thing. So to me, when you start school, you go through plans and you tell kids these are, this is the rules and this is chapter 19 and this is this and this is that. So you're not going to necessarily point out kids, but the school needs to know up front how it is they're going to function. So as you're going through this, looking at the plan and getting inputs from your principals and whoever else you're looking at, you're going to have to firm up some things on some of the procedures, especially for secondary schools. So I'm happy that you're doing all this, but I'm just saying there's these little bitty things, because
I agree.
sometimes kids are smarter than we are on how things work. So we just need to be, schools need to be prepared on how to deal with it in an appropriate way. Okay? Thanks.
Thank you. This is all very useful feedback. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Oh, yes. Board Member Williams.
Just some observations listening to the discussion, Steve. One is that I think you should consider this quarterly thing, maybe once or twice a year, because it's of the reasons that were stated. And I listen to everybody so carefully, I kind of lost the other thought, but, the parent. I think you should pursue the thoughts from Member Hasselby. If 13 is truly, a legally recognized cutoff for mandatory parent notice or not, I think it would help to have, if that's the right age, so then the answer to Mr. Horner would be if you're not 13, parental notice will be mandatory. If you're 13 or older, it's up to the student. I think you should explore that, because that would help everybody, and including put the parents on notice too, where that age is, when it's going to be up to the student. Because I understand the dilemma. we have an anti-bullying, anti-harassment policy, but young people can be persecuted at home for these feelings and this intention. So you don't want them to be abused. You want to protect them from that abuse. But to just leave it vague, especially if there may be some legal borders, I think it'd be better for all concerned if there is that knowledge of what the cutoff is.
Appreciate that.
And I do recognize too, I mean, I think we all gotta recognize, I mean, frankly, compare this to North Carolina, you know, what we're reading about it in the newspapers. I mean, these guidelines represent a humane approach. As we have more experiences in the schools, and more people look at them, you're gonna get more feedback, you're gonna address issues that arise. But you know, this puts us in a very humane place. And I think we should all be grateful for that.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? So I think you heard from your board members that generally moving in a positive direction, gave some excellent feedback on details and specific actual suggestions. And I just want to stress and thank the team as well for creating and working so hard on these guidelines. And as you move into the next step of implementation, how important it is to partner with our community resources, particularly as Board Member Williams mentioned, grounding it here in Hawaii and the culture of Hawaii and really keeping that at the forefront of our values here and how it reflects in our implementation. So thank you very much.
And Chair Howard, I just want to say thank you to you for your leadership and help in moving this along as well. I appreciate it.
Okay, so before we actually move on to the action items, I understand we have some testimony. I'd like to call for testimony of those who were unable to testify earlier. Mr. Kenyon, can you please provide these names?
Yes, Chair. The first testifier is Jennifer Salcido.
Aloha.
Thank you for your time today. Apologies for going out of order. I was not familiar with the format of these meetings, but now I will be for the future. I'm Dr. Jennifer Salcedo. I'm here speaking on behalf of the Hawaii section of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So this seems a bit out of order, but I wanted to provide testimony on policy 103.8, the prohibition of condom distribution in the public schools. Our professional organization that represents OBGYN physicians and trainees strongly supports the availability of condoms in public schools as a means of reducing the health burdens of sexually transmitted infections and unplanned pregnancies, which are major public health concerns. Unfortunately, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis are increasing in rates in the U.S. for the first time since 2006 per the CDC. And also, unfortunately, Hawaii has the lowest rate of condom use in the United States. So we rank 50 out of 50, which contributes to our substantially higher rates of chlamydia and adolescent pregnancy than in the U.S. as a whole. And as a professional organization, we believe that the availability of condoms in schools allows students to make more responsible sexual health decisions and has not been shown to increase sexual activity among those that were not taking part in those activities anyway. So I work in a teen clinic for part of my clinical responsibilities, and unfortunately every clinic session we have adolescents and their partners from Hawaii that are dealing with very serious health concerns related to sexually transmitted infections. Sometimes I question our lab services because of the number of positive chlamydia results that I get back after every session, and it's very disheartening. That's not speaking to additional issues of unplanned pregnancies and those consequences. So we strongly would support a change in this policy and would be happy to serve as a resource at any time if that would be helpful to our school system.
Thank you, Dr. Salcedo. We do have a question for you, so please come back. Mr. Horner.
Doctor, thank you for testifying and thank you for what you do for kids. Does your organization know what the statistics are for the rest of the states in distribution of condoms at the school level?
Sure. I unfortunately do not, know off the top of my head the percentage of public school systems that allow distribution of condoms, but I'm happy to look into that
So
issue.
you made
and
an
get back to you.
implication that we're 50th in the nation, kind of implying that the other school systems do and we don't, and that's why we're number 50. It was kind of a
I think that there are probably a multitude of factors that lead to our being the lowest rate of condom use. As a professional organization, we think that condom availabilities in schools would assist in that rate, but I'm not attempting to make a statement that that's the reason for the low condom use in our state or elsewhere.
So if you have that information, it'd be helpful.
Sure, I'm happy to look into that.
Thank you, Doctor. Chair.
Thank you, Doctor. Hold on, one more question. Mr. Williams.
If we change the policy or eliminate the policy to do it the way that you're recommending, so practically speaking, in the schools, how do you see that distribution working? In other words, where would a student go? How would this happen?
I think that, my knowledge is that of a health professional, and I'm not involved in the intimate workings of the schools. I think that that's something that would probably need to be, worked out on a more individual basis due to different setups and different.
Great. So I'll bring it up in discussion when we get to that policy, but I think for some of us, that's really the issue. It's not just a matter of saying we're going to reverse the policy, but if we were to reverse the policy, how would everything happen, and how would the staff deal with it, and all of that? There's a lot of things that would have to be thought out in a reversal of the policy.
I think that's a very important point, and all I can say is that, we would be happy to serve as a resource in that
You're
process if
available,
it would be
right?
helpful.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. It looks like Mr. Min has a question or a comment.
Today sounds like deja vu because 30 years ago this same topic was brought up. And sex education was brought up, and I happened to be the chair, and we had quite a bit of sentiment, and I was the devil and the incarnate. And well, let me say something. But a couple years later, something happened. HIV hit. And I think that's what we were trying to indicate to them at that time. I didn't have anybody come back and tell me anything after HIV became such a crisis. So I agree with Mr. Williams that you need to really look at this in terms of how you're going to distribute it. I don't know if any student would, readily walk up and say, can I have a couple of these? So I think you need to look at it more in terms of sex education and, your recommendations. But this was brought up.
Thank you for that historical context. Kenyon.
Next testifier is Shantini Baidu.
Aloha Shanti. Doctor.
Hi, good morning. I too, like Dr. Salcedo, wasn't certain of the process here, and so next time we'll be all in accordance with the lineup. I'm Shamini Raidu. I'm an OBGYN physician and a family planning fellow, and I too work in the teen clinic with Dr. Salcedo. I'd also like to be here to speak in opposition to the ban on providing condoms in our public schools. By graduation, almost half of the students in Hawaii have initiated sexual activity. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we have the lowest rate of condom use in the country, and also some of the highest rates of unintended pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections. Those things tend to go hand in hand. Condoms are more than 80% effective at preventing pregnancies and about 98% effective at preventing an infection. It's one of the only methods we have available to prevent the transmission of infections. In our teen clinic, as Dr. Salcedo mentioned, we see dozens of students every month who have sexually transmitted infections and unintended pregnancies. I don't think there's a robust amount of data available on condom distribution programs, but the data that we do have, Mr. Horner, to your earlier question, is pretty promising. A public school system in Holyoke, Massachusetts, implemented a condom distribution program, and over the course of 3 years, they saw a decrease in their gonorrhea and chlamydia rates in their male students by 47%, which is nearly unheard of in a public school system. So I think we certainly have precedent set from other places that can help us in guiding this. There's a number of different ways, Mr. Williams, that these have been implemented in various places. And certainly there are guidelines from other organizations that can help us with putting these through. I think that prohibiting condoms in our public schools doesn't stop our students from having sex, but it does increase the chance that they're going to have unsafe sex and put themselves at significant risk. And if we are concerned about their health and their safety, and we're going to improve the sexual health education we provide them, which I know is a priority of the board and that we're working towards, but I think it has to go hand in hand with allowing them to access those services as well. Thank you. I think answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Raidu. Any questions? Thank you for answering some of the questions in your testimony.
Chair, there's no more testimony.
Thank you, everybody. We're now moving on to recommendation for action. Action items. First, we have action on 3 charter school requests for waivers from Board Policy 104.1, graduation and related, for implementation in school year 2016-2017. And I would like to take up the waiver requests one at a time. So first, I'd like to call up on Commissioner Member John Kim, Organizational Performance Manager Danny Vasconcelos, and Educational Specialist Cindy Henry to provide the State Public Charter School Commission's recommendation on Hakupu'u Learning Center waiver request. Welcome.
Good morning, Chair Hollinow, Vice Chair Williams, and members of the committee. My name is Danny Vasconcelos. I'm the Organizational Performance Manager with the Commission. The Commission appreciates this opportunity to bring these requests to the board, as it's another sort of unique characteristics that we have of our charter schools. Before we get into these specific individual requests from our 3 schools, I'd just like to briefly provide some background and context, basically of why we're here today. I know it's been a full agenda, so I'll try to keep this brief so we can get directly to our charter school requests. Basically, overall, charter schools are required as public schools to follow the education policy set by the Board of Education. That being said, our charter school contract, which is the formal agreement that charter schools have with the Commission vis-a-vis the state, requires them, there's a specific provision in there about graduation requirements that require charter schools to follow the board policy that was previously 4540, now 104.1. And the way our contract was worded, we're currently in what we call Contract 2.0, which is the contract that 33 out of our 34 charter schools are under right now, that had a 3-year term that began in 2014 and will end in June 30, 2017. So the way that contract provision is worded right now is that the Board of Education graduation requirement would apply to incoming 9th graders for school year 2013-2014. Sort of moving ahead, that means specifically the board policy applies to our seniors for next school year, which is why we're actually coming to the board now with these waiver requests from charter schools. Just as some quick background, there previously has been one charter school that has already had a graduation requirement waiver granted. That was University Laboratory School. They asked for an increase in credits, which the board granted. I believe that was in 2014. Currently, out of our 34 charter schools, there are 20 charter schools which provide a high school program. As the commission sort of looked into this to get information on the graduation requirements, we found that the overwhelming majority of our schools basically follow the BOE's policy to the letter. The only sort of differences that we did find are just maybe in the way courses are titled, but the schools did sort of use the BOE guidelines, the ACCNs, to make sure that the courses have that corresponding number. So in case there's any sort of transfers or anything like that, then transcripts will be able to be provided to incoming DOE schools or upon graduation with other, hopefully, colleges that our students are going to. So basically, when the University Laboratory came to the board for their graduation requirement, the process that was set up was that the commission would sort of first take a look at it, basically vet the request and provide a recommendation to the board, because as specified in the law and in the charter contract, it's actually the Board of Education that grants the waiver. It's not the Charter School Commission itself. So the Charter School Commission only provides a recommendation, and in that case, again, to specify the criteria that we use are the board's requirements itself when we look at these graduation request waivers. As I mentioned, most of our charter schools do follow the board's requirements. But in the case of these 3 schools that we're discussing today, we are asking for, in some instances, a slight to fairly significant deviation from the board's requirements. I can take any questions if you have anything on the background of the process. If not, I'd like to turn it over to our commissioners so we can get specific to our specific 3 schools.
Any questions, board members? Okay, I see none, so proceed.
And our first school is Hockey Pool Learning Center.
Sherman Halligal, again, I'm the new guy on the block, but as we look to this request, the commission, both in executive session and open session, spent over an hour looking at data, looking at information concerning this request. And the result of that was the commission decided that we did not have enough information, that we need to recommend that we not approve this waiver at the time. I thought, and the commission thought, it was important that we give you kind of a summary about what our deliberations were, so that you wouldn't have to go through that whole thing yourself. The concerns of the commission were that when we compared the credit hours that the DOE requires and the strict requirements on what constitutes credit, we couldn't correlate that to the credit hours being granted by Hockey Pool. And without any way of doing that, you not only have problems with students transferring in and out of the school, but we couldn't evaluate what a credit means from the school compared to what the DOE requires. And then we looked at how those credits were awarded. And it is a project-based learning school, but they were awarding credits for high school completion based on participation in hours, from what we could tell, but no definitive way of defining whether or not mastery of content was occurring. And so that was an additional question and additional doubt. In looking at who's granting the credit, whether it's high school or not, we couldn't determine whether those teachers or individuals were licensed, in fact, to grant the credit. Did they have a person licensed in secondary science granting credit for secondary science? And we couldn't definitively define that either. And so since we couldn't match their credit hours to the state credit hours, we couldn't determine whether or not high school credit was being given for high school mastery of content, and we couldn't look at the qualifications of the people granting those credit. We looked at that and said, how can we allow a school to continue to do this without defining what the credit hours, how they transfer, and all that kind of thing? So the commission decided to recommend that we disapprove, that you disapprove this request for a waiver. And I guess my final comment would be more personal, although I voiced it at the commission meeting itself. I look at the granting of a high school diploma as a fairly significant thing that the Board of Education does.